Parallel Lines, the third album by Blondie. Let's give you a little bit of a rundown. Blondie was formed in New York City in August 1974 by Debbie Harry on vocals, who is a Jersey girl, I'd like to point out, so I'll throw that out there.
Very proud of that, aren't you?
Yeah. Yep. Chris Stein on guitar, Clement Burke on drums, James Destry on keyboards, and Gary Valentine on bass. Although at the beginning, in August 1974, it was only Debbie Harry and Chris Stein and some other members of the band, and then they added the rest of the band as they went along, leading up to the first album. They would also add a sixth member of the band before this album that we'll talk about a little bit down the road. I think those that know a little bit about Blondie, I certainly did know that for the duration of the band, Debbie Harry and Chris Stein were in a romantic relationship. Chris Stein was in a band. He joined the Stilettos, the name of a group. He and Debbie Harry were both in bands. Debbie Harry was a vocalist with the band. They started a romantic relationship. Debbie Harry was actually 5 years older than the rest of the band. So when the band started, she was 29, which at that time was a little bit older, and the rest of the band was either 24 or 25 years old. So
she's robbing the cradle.
She was ahead of it. Before she became the vocalist for Blondie, besides singing as well, she was a waitress, and she was also a Playboy bunny, the waitresses that at the Playboy Club and stuff like that. And she later became she was in Playboy later as well, so full circle right there. The band name came from catcalls that truckers would make. Debbie Harry did not start as a blonde. She dyed her hair blonde, and truckers would say, "Hey, Blondie," to her all the time, or some variation of it, so they decided to run with it in the band. Actually, I think it was Josh who made this same mistake.
Yes.
There is an element, so you've seen the Don't Speak video for No Doubt, right?
Yes.
Where the whole theme is sort of like the Gwen Stefani gets all the attention, right? While the rest of the band is shoved in the background. That was a big deal for Blondie as well. Like many of the focus of the band and even people thinking of the band thought that was like Debbie Harry and some other guys, or she's Blondie and the rest are there.
Yeah.
When in reality, they were very much a band. It was it didn't seem to bleed over necessarily, that at least, to resentment of Debbie Harry. I think there probably was some, right? But I think it was more, there was frustration to the point where they actually they made a button that said, I think it was Blondie is a band, not a person. Like they actually had buttons that were on it. And I think Debbie Harry was aware of the fact, you know what I mean, that it was a band and stuff. But the origin story there, I know it's an easy thing to say, oh, girl in front of a bunch of guys, new wavy, elements and stuff. But there are some elements of how like the Blondie story played out that are very similar to the No Doubt story as well, right? With the blonde female lead singer who's not a blonde, naturally charismatic, had a relationship with a member of the band. I mean, there are a lot of overlaps, right, that go into that. So Blondie forms, and they play CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, which are two very well-known clubs. CBGB's will certainly come up again in the next segment with the Ramones, and probably Max's will too, I think.
Yes, correct.
Yep, there's two groups that were known for sort of the punk and new wave and, that like mid to late 70s New York era that was like simultaneously incredibly exhilarating and also like terrifying, that was kind of in the late 70s and the early 80s. So that had all the edge, you feel like you could see that scene. And you also had, the burgeoning hip hop scene that would come later. You had like some remnants of like the Lou Reed scene, right? Along with like, the city's bankrupt and stuff like that. So you've got that environment, Son of Sam, right? All that stuff's going on in this era. There's a lot of myth making there, but yeah, New York was a very vital but also not so pleasant place. You had to be a certain type of personality who was there. Sadly, and to tangent for a second, actually in her biography, Debbie Harry told like several stories that were alarming, one of which even includes that she was raped in the apartment that she and Stein shared in New York, and there were other stories as well. So they, it was that era of New York, right? Like it was a dangerous and vibrant scene, and the music that comes out of it kind of has that edge, right? And I thought I'd bring that up because we'll be revisiting that, I think, a little bit again with the Ramones, although if I remember, and I don't want to steal Josh's thunder, I think the Ramones actually came from a little bit more of a middle class background, as does Blondie, so for that matter. The first album comes out. It is self-titled. It is actually pretty well reviewed. I will tell this because I am familiar a little bit. The first two Blondie albums are much more what we would consider to be new wave in sound. One thing that was very interesting to me about this was a lot of my knowledge of Blondie, and I know their stuff pretty well, though, was from compilations and greatest hits, right? So I wasn't, I knew like Rapture came later, and I knew like Call Me was a little later, but I wasn't quite sure where each went on. So it was interesting to see which songs made up Parallel Lines. But so anyway, the first album comes out. It's well reviewed. The big thing that comes out of that is they become the opening act for Iggy Pop and David Bowie on that Idiot tour.
Cool.
That we did. And we've covered the Idiot before.
That'd be a fun show.
So that was a good spot, right? You know what I mean? Because you can grow your audience right there. They were on a record label called Private Stock. And then in August 1977, Chrysalis Records actually bought out Blondie's contract from Private Stock. And they were actually in charge of releasing the second album called Plastic Letters. Chrysalis also took the time to reissue, with a little bit more publicity, the debut LP, which sold okay, but certainly not, kind of more of a niche type sales for both of these albums. Blondie at this point, with the five I mentioned before, they expand, they add a bassist, Nigel Harrison, to the group, and Infante actually switches to the guitars. I should mention that Frank Infante is the gentleman's name. He replaces Gary Valentine on the bass. So Infante becomes the bassist, and then when the new member comes in, Nigel Harrison, he actually becomes the second guitarist, joining Chris Stein. So there's actually 6 members of the band on this album, which is, I think, interesting to know. It all starts to come together in March 1978 when Blondie gets 2 hits in the UK. The first one, and I'm familiar with both of these songs, although they're not on this album. The first song that's a hit for them, and they're both in the UK, is the song Denise. It's funny because I'm reading about it, I'm like, I remember it as being Denis, which they actually change it to. They rename the song, but Denise is actually a cover song of a song from, I believe it was the 50s or 60s. And then there's also parentheses, I'm always touched, and then end parentheses, by your presence. Both of those songs you can find, they're singles, but you can find both of them on any greatest hits that you're going to get from Blondie, because they're 2 of Blondie's biggest hits.
D-Nice, right?
Denise, as you'd imagine it's spelled, and D-Nice, not D-Naughty. So they begin recording this album, Parallel Lines, actually in 1978 as well. So a couple things come about that change with Parallel Lines. The first is they made a conscious shift away from being a new wave band, and it's often described, they didn't describe it necessarily this way, and they claim it was less conscious, it was more evolution, but I think just about everybody says that this album represents more of like a eclectic pop sound, which, in some ways could be how we just described Elvis Costello in the previous segment, right? Eclectic pop. They also bring in a gentleman by the name of Mike Chapman to produce this album. So Chapman is just full of quotes on all of the different resources that I came. Chapman is kind of credited for giving the album the sound, the production of this, which is something that many comment as a strength of this album. But Chapman was not a huge fan of working with Blondie, so he said that he found them very difficult to work with. He also said that they were the worst band he ever worked with in terms of natural musical ability. He said Frank Infante was an amazing guitarist, but the rest of them he felt did not go there naturally. The sessions, a lot of the stuff you read talks about how Chris Stein was stoned a lot of the recording during this, and he basically encouraged him to write songs rather than play the guitar because he felt he had a little bit of gift. He also thought Jimmy Destry was a pretty good songwriter. Jimmy Destry's greatest contribution to this album, besides the normal keys that he played and stuff, was that he was heavily a part of Heart of Glass, which is one of probably the biggest song off this album along the way. And I think everybody knows that Heart of Glass is often considered a disco song, but a lot of the vibe of that song is Jimmy Destry's song. I'll tell you, there were 2 different artists and sounds that he said influenced him on Heart of Glass. One was Kraftwerk, interestingly enough. and the other was the drum sound and the sound of the Bee Gees on Saturday Night Fever, which I think you can hear that a little bit more in it than you can Kraftwerk. But if you know that going in, you kind of, when you hear that sort of that, like, I can't really imitate the sound, but the beginning of the song, you know what I mean? That background.
It's like a drum machine almost or something.
It's like, drum machine. You can get a little bit of the Kraftwerk thing there if you listen to it. So Chapman says that he spent a lot of time improving the band. He thought Clem Burke had poor timing playing the drums, which is interesting because Clem Burke becomes like a really well-regarded session player in the 80s. A lot of this stuff felt like settling scores a little bit because, when you hear this album, it doesn't sound like people that can't play. But anyway.
Yeah.
So one person who agreed with me is bassist Nigel Harrison, who became so frustrated with Chapman and sort of his micromanagement and drive for perfection that he threw a synthesizer with him. And Chapman has a quote here, and I do want to say that there's not a lot on what Blondie felt about him, kind of. They kind of speak, that they thought he did a good job with their sound, but I want to say that this is his sort of unchallenged thought, at least as I could say. He goes, "The Blondies were tough in the studio, real tough. None of them liked each other, except Chris and Debbie. There was so much animosity. They were really, really juvenile in their approach to life. A classic New York underground rock band. They didn't give a fuck about anything. They just wanted to have fun and didn't want to work too hard getting it." So that was his take on what it was, which, the DIY emphasis there. Anyway, who knows if this is an accurate reflection. Like I said, there's a lot of people that like to, do different stuff. Picture This becomes a UK top 40 hit from this album, and then Hanging on the Telephone is where they really break through. That makes the UK top 10. It's the album's third single, Heart of Glass, that breaks them in the US. It becomes a #1 single in both the UK and the US and a worldwide hit.
Nice.
The album starts selling like hotcakes, as do the back albums, when people discover that, hey, I don't just like this album, I like some of the other stuff. They also had those singles, and they would continue to have some singles that were non-record singles as well. Sunday Girl actually becomes a big hit in the UK in May, and then One Way or Another hits the US top 40 in August as well. So they're plowing out hits, and Blondie certainly is not starved for hits over the rest of their career. They are, filled with hits. Going back to, I talked a little bit about that Kraftwerk Bee Gees combination. The other thing that they mention with Destry is he had a great appreciation of technology, and he really pushed to include synthesizers more and rework keyboard sections. Most critics really liked this album. There were some purists, I think, within the scene that felt this was a sellout album for Blondie. I didn't get the feeling that Blondie was all that bothered by that tag like others would. I think they were ready to become a pop band, starving musician and such. I don't think they were there anymore. Heart of Glass was one of the first songs that really is, and you've probably seen the music video before. It's like Debbie Harry kind of looking, some people say stoned, right? Like sort of looking with bedroom eyes also a little bit at the camera as she's sort of like nonchalantly dancing in the front, right, while the band plays behind her. I do remember as a kid seeing that video quite a bit. It's like the thing that stands out to me about that video is like you get Blondie immediately watching that video. It's like there's these guys behind, right, that sort of set the tone, and then like the visual of Debbie Harry to go along with you get it. You know what I mean? You get the whole package of the detached sexuality. You know what I mean?
Isn't it very like gauzy looking video too?
It's exactly. Yeah. Yep. It's sort of like like a foggy lens type deal where stuff like that. So it's got that like 70s thing that looks like home video-ish or you know UHF, porno, like it's like all of those like aesthetics, you know what I mean, like built in that only the 70s can have. So they had a video there. The music video, like they said, it kind of was another big piece of it because it gave an image to the band, and the band became very popular, including with Andy Warhol, who, as you might imagine, loved the band. And so Debbie Harry, in fact, credits him quite a bit with sort of pushing her to always look at the present or the future and not get stuck in the past. So Blondie releases 2 more albums, Eat to the Beat in 1979 and Auto American in 1980, which have singles on both of them. I would say after Auto American, the wheels start to come off a little bit. There's some infighting in the band. Interestingly, Infante actually sues the band for not getting used enough in their albums because
geez.
it's sort of they're all working on side projects. He does it. He settles and then he rejoins the band, which I thought was fascinating. It's like you sue
Is
the
that
band
a suable offense? Like you didn't use me? Like what legal thing are they breaking?
There was a lot going on there, as you might imagine. There was also quite a bit of drug use amongst members of the band that was going on. They then released one more album in 1982, The Hunter. While shortly before this time too, they actually become friends with Fab Five Freddy and Grandmaster Flash in the nascent hip hop scene of New York. In fact, the Rapture video features Fab Five Freddy, and he gets a call out on it, as does Grandmaster Flash. But Grandmaster Flash's record album record label did not allow him to be in the video, so he was replaced in the video. For that song, if you ever see it. That's another song with a video in it. So Rapture and Call Me are actually two of the earliest examples of videos in some ways. Stein actually gets a rare, like, autoimmune sort of genetic disease. He does not, in fact, all members of Blondie are still alive, which was a nice I was like, whoa, nice, all six still alive. But he gets this condition, and he's in very bad shape for many years. Harry and him are still dating at this point, but Harry actually, they disband the band because of this, because Harry leaves she'd released a solo album and she goes to basically take care of him. In the mid-'80s, they break up, but they remain very good friends to the point where she is the godmother to both of Stein's children along the way. So they stayed friends. They do make a return that I do remember in 1998. They had that Ave Maria song, I remember, that was on the first one, and most of the members of the band came back and performed, and they actually continued to release music and albums through the early 2000s. Blondie sort of was one of those bands. They were big, and then they were dismissed as like a pop confection and kind of put back, but then in like the mid to late 80s, they started resurfacing a little bit, and then in the early 90s was when it really started to turn for them, because you started to see people name dropping them. I mentioned No Doubt before, but that was certainly one of them. Shirley Manson, different people talking about how much they enjoyed it, especially sort of, retconning, I think accurately, like Debbie Harry, being the female voice, right, of the tough New York scene. I mean, she is. She's the chick. So much so that I appreciate her edge that my niece, true story, one of the first gifts I ever bought her was a Debbie Harry picture with her Blondie on it. And at age 8 months, she is a Blondie herself. She has a picture that my sister took. It's one of the best pictures ever. I will not put it on Twitter, but she had just gotten out of bed and her head's all sort of mussed up and stuff. And she's got a groggy look on her face, and she's got this Debbie Harry Blondie t-shirt on, right?
Nice.
And she looks sort of like Debbie Harry does, albeit for different reasons. And it's one of my prides and joys as an uncle right there. So I enjoyed that way. Anyway, like I said, a little bit longer bio this week because Blondie's a really interesting band. It's a little bit of a take there. It's the only time we're covering them on the run. So last time Josh started us off. We'll go Matt, Josh, and myself. I just realized, by the way, too, that I didn't mention the tracks I put at the beginning.
Yeah, so we didn't do the numbers either, so I was going to mention that.
We'll go. I'll let you do the numbers in a second, but we did, in the opening montage, we did Hanging on the Telephone, and you've already heard it by now, so you already know the song that you're going to be listening to, so I don't need to repeat that as well at the beginning. But it's probably going to be Heart of Glass that I'm going to put at the beginning of this as well, so you just heard that already. Matt, run the numbers for us, and then... Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so this is Parallel Lines comes in at number 72 on Best Ever Albums in the 1970s, number 2 in 1978, number 285 of all time, and it also made Rolling Stone's list at number 146, so another highly regarded album there. And this is another highly regarded album by me, Matt. I really like this record, and I mean, I knew... Let's see, what did I know? I obviously knew One Way or Another and Heart of Glass, and I think that was it. So not terribly familiar with Blondie's catalog. I can attest to that Maria song from 1998. I totally forgot about that, but that was a great song too, so I like that. And I liked some of their other singles as well. So this wasn't a surprise that I liked this so much, and I think I had a similar reaction to this record as I did with the Elvis Costello record in that I like the variety and the different types of. It wasn't probably as genre bending as Elvis Costello was, but I definitely was picking up on different genres kind of blending well together here. There's certainly more of a there's some punk elements here. There's some 50s doo-wop elements. It's kind of like old school 50s kind of music. And I'm just looking at here. There's a Buddy Holly cover. I didn't realize that I'm Gonna Love You Too is a Buddy Holly song. So that's news. And obviously Heart of Glass is kind of its own thing, with the effects there. Yes, it does have that disco kind of label that it gets. I can see that. It's certainly not like, Saturday Night Fever type disco, but it's got some of those types of effects that are kind of similar. But there are some great songs on here that I never heard of. Picture This, I thought was fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I love Debbie Harry's voice on that. She does this really high kind of a vocal that she does in the chorus, and it just goes to a different level. I think the way that she sings that, I thought that was really cool. And then like a song like that, and then it goes into a really interesting song like Fade Away and Radiate, which is kind of like a slowed down kind of more of an indie rock type of song. It's a little darker, so there's some darker elements to hear as well. Sunday Girl is, gosh, that's just pop genius. That's just bubblegum, music right there. Just really, really catchy. Can very easily see why that was a single. And songs, I think that this is just a really fun record. Lots of variety, like Debbie Harry's vocals. And I think, new wave. It's interesting to say that you're saying that this was them trying to go away from new wave, but I'm still picking up on elements of that. And I know we discussed new wave last week,
sure.
And kind of what makes new wave and what is it and what isn't it.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's a catch-all. Maybe I'll learn a little bit more about what it actually is, or I know, John, you kind of read a definition before, but that's still here. It's not like they, I don't know their first two albums, but I can't imagine that they've deviated terribly from there. But this is a great record, and I really enjoyed it. The more I listened to it, the more I liked it. For a lot of variety, and it's interesting, because it'll do one thing on one song, and then it'll do something else here, for the next song, and I like that. And there's not a dud on here, so big thumbs up for me again.
Well, real quick, Matt, for the first two albums, for those that might know a little bit about it, the first album, probably the two songs, and they definitely have a new wave vibe to them, is like Ex Offender is on the first album, and Out in the Streets, those two. Ripper to Shreds is on that one too, so that's a little bit more.
I'm not sure if I know any of those. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, those will be ones, if you know Blondie, you'll kind of know that. The second one has I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, and Denise, which we mentioned before. Those would be the ones in there. So for those that may know Blondie, but like me, sometimes wonder where the hits come in, that's where they're going to sequence up. And a lot of the even bigger hits come later, that I think probably are the ones you may be more aware of, Matt, because they come later.
This isn't just a good album. This is a perfect pop record, and I love it so much. I didn't know Blondie outside of their hits, and I'm so glad I listened to this. I feel like this is a band, or at least this record, all of these songs are good, like Matt said, good to great. And Blondie, to me, at least based on the listen of this album, is Debbie Harry primarily. Her voice has such attitude, sexiness, and range. She's able to kind of vary the way she sings different songs. She can speed up and slow down, and kind of has kind of different ranges to her singing, and that brings different elements and attitudes to each song. I thought there was that criticism that the drumming wasn't very good, but I like the drumming on this album, and I noticed it. I think it's hard for me to separate how much of a kind of Debbie Harry is such like a punk rock sex symbol, and kind of her style and look and attitude, how much that's influenced, not just Gwen Stefani and Shirley Manson, but a lot of bands and music. And
what Miley
style.
Cyrus is trying to do now is a lot of
Hot Topic. The idea of Hot Topic, the store, my my ideal woman is probably Debbie Harry on some level, unintentionally, or in that subconscious level, and I just love the pop sound to this album. They do incorporate something. I noticed some reggae guitar on Fade Away and Radiate, some reggae like kind of guitar chords and strumming. The Heart of Glass is actually probably not my favorite song on this album. I like almost like every other song more, maybe just because Heart of Glass is so overplayed and maybe it's such a deviation. I think they did do like a disco mix of that at some point, so it's like 8 minutes long and repeating and stuff so people can dance to it at a disco. But I was really surprised about all the songs I didn't like because they're all really great. And the something like 11:59, which was a fast song and has a good use of the keyboard in it, and like Matt said, Sunday Girl with the hand claps and kind of the pop fun to it, and even something like Picture This, which is an example of her switching her singing voice. It kind of takes this soaring feel to it, and it's also light and airy, and other times in the album she's like kind of growly and more in your face and aggressive with her singing, which I really responded to the album as a whole, and it's probably going to be up in my top 10 for sure.
Oh, damn. Hey, John, before you go, can I just forgot about something, but the song I Know But I Don't Know, and I'm curious your thought on this, because I'm thinking that's an interesting song because you've got there's she's singing, Debbie Harry singing, there's a guy singing as well. That's and it's a little bit off, like the tone is a little bit off. I'm hearing a little bit of Sonic Youth in that type of song. I don't know.
I mean,
it's not noise rock, but I was just the way that they were singing it and the way that the music was a little bit off. I was kind of hearing a little bit of that, and I didn't know if you thought.
Yeah, there's a little bit of feedback on that album too. Like if I remember correctly, right? That starts with it. I mean, there's some similarities between. I mean, Kim Gordon doesn't lean into the sex symbol. Yeah. See, I don't know if really like Debbie Harry did as much as she's just a beautiful woman, even when she played it down, right? Like it kind of was there. Yeah. But there's a lot of similarities between Kim Gordon and Debbie Harry in terms of having like lower registers, right? That are different there, and they can sing when need be, and they're the woman amongst the guys. So yeah, I see what you're saying, Matt. There's elements, for sure. It's funny because, like I said, off the top of my head, I was like, okay, Parallel Lines. I was thinking to myself, it's very weird because I like Blondie so much, so I've never like listened to their albums. And it's funny, as I'm listening to this, I'm like, well, I have listened to this album because I know like every song on this album. Yeah. And the thing with Blondie is I don't just know their greatest hits. I know other songs of theirs because when I was getting my education in the type of music that I love, Blondie was in the scene / the late 70s that's a big piece of my formative music, right? This is the late 70s era. And as I was collecting groups that I liked, people sort of said, you need to check out Blondie because they'll help you to explain some different stuff along the way. And like, I kind of first started listening to Blondie when Blondie had gone from, it's just interesting to think about it because they went from like edgy to like not edgy for some people, and then back to being edgy again, right? So they were right back on that thing where they were getting the edgy again, right? And people were sort of revisiting it. This album's fantastic all the way around. I mean, Hanging on the Telephone, I've always loved that song. Yeah. I love the structure of, like the dun 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 dun, and then it changes, chords through it. It's awesome. The lyrics, it's like it quickly kind of lets you know that it sets the theme of this album lyrically, which is sort of like bad romance, I think is the best way I would describe.
Yeah, there was a lot of there with that.
Yeah, that's sort of, I think they even described it as they went away from sort of more impersonal / esoteric lyrics to like bad romance type lyrics. They didn't say that, but that's what I'm calling it as. One Way or Another, I know Josh said that Heart of Glass. I think One Way or Another is actually even more like omnipresent in some ways than than Heart of Glass is, especially in the modern day. You'll hear it on commercials and stuff, which is always weird to me. But
it definitely has the most Spotify listens at 194 million, as opposed to 85 million for Heart of Glass. So,
and that's a great new wave song. Like that's a song I think of as like a new wave song, like that one way or another. Picture This is a cool song about like Debbie Harry like asking more from a lover, right? But it goes in a different direction. That's where, like Matt said, you know, Blondie has that thing where they have the roots to the. It's funny because like the Ramones have that too, and as does Velvet Underground, a bunch of stuff where you can hear sort of that like influence of the 50s and the Phil Spector music, right? That's the stuff where all this is kind of coming from. And when you think of it coming from, you know, it's like California sound coming from New York is how I always would describe that, with the orchestral elements, right? That's all over there. Fade Away and Radiate's placement is fantastic. I know Rob Sheffield has famously said that like the best song lyric in all of pop music is in Fade Away and Radiate, and I'll quote it later at the end of this, but as you might imagine, Rob Sheffield is extremely a big fan of Blondie. Like Blondie did have a very big following amongst New York City folks, which Rob Sheffield is, and also within the club and the gay scene, right? Like before, because they sort of, you know, they were very outspoken on different issues and stuff like that. Pretty Baby goes, it's just all these. 11:59 comes in the middle of it, and that's a fantastic hidden gem, right? Matt mentioned Sunday Girl being like this almost perfect pop confection, and it is. It's a display of Debbie Harry's voice, all the way to the end, right? It's just great stuff. I will challenge you on one thing, Matt, though. Josh. I don't think of Blondie as just being Debbie Harry. And let me start by saying she's awesome, and she's the extra sauce that makes the band work. But if you didn't have the pieces behind her creating like a real solid new way, I don't think just you can hire just session musicians and stuff to do what Blondie's doing. I think there's a tightness to this that comes from being a live band, right? That plays all the time, which is what Blondie was, and sort of lives in the same area and fights and bonds and all the different stuff. I just don't think that you can get that unless you have a tight unit. And I do think, much like I much prefer Gwen Stefani in the construct of No Doubt, and I just think there's always something missing for me of like her fullness when she's the solo stuff. She's there, but it's not there. I feel a little bit about that with Debbie Harry too. I just feel like at her best, it's couched as the leader of this group out in front of it. So I will challenge you on that a little bit, Josh, because I think the bass lines, the drumming, the guitar work, and sort of some of the interesting stuff they're doing, the whole is equal to the sum of the parts in this, and that's what makes a great band. And I think having 6 pieces helps quite a bit too. I don't. There aren't going to be many pop albums that we listen to. And I even hesitate to call it just quite pop, because it genre bends just like Elvis Costello and the Talking Heads do. But, you know, we really we're seeing that like the late 70s, right? London and New York is kind of the center of the world for music right now, because most of the stuff we're covering is there's exceptions to that, right? But like that's really. And I'm not going to say it's the peak, because both of those scenes have always had a lot going on, right? And, you know, different moments. But the late 70s, I think, really started and was defined in terms of edgy, on the cusp music in those two areas. And I almost feel like the 70s is becoming there's like a, and I don't want to play this as stereotypes, right? But I feel like there's music that was hitting in the heartland, right? Like the AOR and the big rock and stuff like that. And then there's like the stuff that's being played on the coasts. And I see right now the biggest disconnect between probably what was happening in cities and what was happening everywhere else. And I could have just imagined that you could be in 1978 and there's this whole... You imagine the people who could listen to a lot of music might not even know that Elvis Costello and the Ramones and Blondie are around, right? Unless they're watching the right shows, because you're still operating in a musical ecosystem where like you kind of had to like take another step to discover the edgier stuff. And and I don't want to pick on states, right? But if you're living in a place where it was harder to get it, I could just see this alternate universe where this was going on, and yet the vast majority of the country having no idea that this was happening. I think it's one of the interesting things to me about the 70s is you could probably see groups that sold like 3 million albums, and yet half of the country, even contemporaries of age, might not have any idea that this was on the radio, you know, because, and I feel like to some degree until Blondie puts out Heart of Glass and, you know, starts to get perceived as disco, which would permeate there, which is funny in its own right, because disco was this hilariously niche subculture till it broke huge in middle America. So it was really interesting to think of it in that construct too. But yeah, I mean, Debbie Harry's just got that thing that you can't teach, right? She's got like sexuality while also not having to be taken as just a sex object. And it's so easy to just view somebody as a sex object or to view them as a non-sex object, right? But to be able to be both a sex object and be taken seriously, I mean, there aren't many females in this era that were able to walk that line, right? Like most females that you would hear about, like they talk about how much of a challenge it was, right? I think we talked about Linda Ronstadt, right? And she talked about that eternally. You know what I mean? That like she was this cute person that people just, you know, really wanted to like, you know, pose it as a sex symbol. She's like, no, I'm a touring musician who does, and you just hear that story over and over again. I feel like, don't get me wrong, I'm sure plenty of ink was spilled trying to paint Debbie Harry into that corner, but even now you can see that there's just an edge to her that, you know, that let's do somebody else, by the way, that we haven't talked about, Madonna, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking of her. Yep.
You know, much like Debbie Harry, who is a bridge and tunnel girl. That's a term that you guys, I don't know how familiar you are with that, but that's like the people that grew up in New Jersey, right? And they'd come up to New York on weekends and sort of had like an alternate life, right? You know, it's in those of us who are from New Jersey, like to some degree I was that, you know, going to shows in New York when I was a teenager, right? Bridge and tunnel guy, but like, you know, she's a bridge and tunnel girl, and, you know, Madonna gets to New York from, you know, Michigan, right? So it's not a true bridge and tunnel, but it's the same origin story, right? You know, she goes to college and, you know, in New York, and that's where she wants to be. She wants to be where the action is. And there's a lot of like Madonna's story in Debbie Harry, right? You know what I mean? Like a tough girl who's unrepentantly like sexual, right? You know what I mean? But also, you know, clearly a force of her own that you just can't write off because she just won't allow you to, right? And also sort of like tamer of men, but also, you know, seduced, you know, but also like taken seriously by men, you know, and very New York, even though she's not technically from New York, identifiably New York. So yeah, so there's another, I think, good core. And Sonic Youth's from New York, Matt, if you want to truly keep it going, you know, so Kim Gorso, she's another, you know, variation on that theme. So shout out New York, man. It's every time I read an article about how New York is supposed, every time I read a story about how, you know, New York is going to die, right, because it's expensive to live there, and, you know, people, you know, No, people are pearl clutching in areas that would never want to live in New York, and they're like, oh, everybody's gonna, with commuting, right? You know, telecommute, everybody's gonna move to the Poconos or, you know, Wyoming. You don't even need New York. Bullshit. New York will always be New York. Always be New York, right? I think I read one time there's like 4 true American cities, right? And, you know, or true cities that will never die in America, right? LA, New York, New Orleans, and Miami. They're the 4 unique cities in the entire country.
Was that Tennessee Williams? I think he said that. He's like, everywhere else is Cleveland.
Everywhere else is Cleveland, exactly. And I don't think he put Miami in there.
Detroit
I think
or something, yeah.
Yeah, I think he was saying L.A., New York, and New Orleans. I
thought he said San Francisco, but anyway, yeah, there's certain.
But that's the idea. Those are the places that will always. There's always someone coming as someone's going, right? And that's what makes them.
Yeah.
And this is like, I want to give a shout out to New York because the vibrancy that I think Josh is hearing and we're hearing and stuff like that, it's a London and it's a New York thing, and it's very much a syncretic. I've said that 3 times, but I'm going to keep to, you know, immigrants mixed with people that are chasing their dreams, right? Who are willing to, like, you know, chase their dream, throw caution to the wind, live poor, right? You know what I mean? Live around other people that they didn't in their hometown, experiment with different genres, because why not? Because you're hearing all of them. That's what it is, you know? It's that vibe, and I think this album greatly produced that. So I'll stop talking, but this will be high on my list too, Josh. I don't know where it'll come in exactly, but it'll be high on my list, and another great one.